And just as part of the housekeeping rules as well, if people could keep their microphones on mute and keep their videos off while Kate is speaking, just to make sure we don't overload the system. And there'll be some time for questions at the end of the presentation. But if you could just pop those into the chat, that would be great. And then I can sort of curate those for Kate. But welcome to our session on emerging issues in conservation. This is a new seminar series that's trying to highlight some of the work coming out through the Society's journals that's, really interesting, really cutting edge, that needs sort of, to be focused on immediately. And so we're really lucky to have Kate Watermeyer here to speak to us today. Kate's at Deacon University in Australia. She's got a background in marine biology, but she's really interested in biodiversity indicators and thinking about how well they perform, how well they track trends, and how we can actually strengthen those indicators. So today she's going to be telling us about some work she's done with her colleagues in Australia and the UK, telling us about what she's learned about how we can improve global indicators in terms of their accuracy and their value. So thank you, Kate. Take it away.
Great, thanks, Carly. Let me just do the screen share quickly. Is that looking okay to you, everyone?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, great. So thanks for coming. It's great to see such a nice, diverse group of people here this evening or this morning, whatever time it is for you. And thanks to Mark and SCB for inviting me to take part in this series. It's really a privilege. So yeah, I'm going to be talking a little bit about a paper that's in conservation biology at the moment of ours that looks at assessing global biodiversity indicators. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time at the end talking about some ongoing work that we've got in this space going forwards and at the moment. So biodiversity is a really complex and multidimensional concept, and that makes it really difficult to measure and to monitor. So that's why we've got indicators, right? So there's been a whole stack of biodiversity indicators that have been developed for different reasons around the world from different data sets to try and monitor biodiversity. And they're used for things like monitoring and reporting on states and trends, trying to understand the impacts of policy or policy changes, and also monitoring progress towards conservation goals. And that can be anything from a local to these global goals like the SDGs and the Aichi targets. And for example, Aichi target 12 looks at extinction of threatened species, and that's got a whole range of indicators associated with it. For instance, things like the Red List Index, which looks at changing extinction risk. A bunch of abundance indices like the Living Planet Index and the Wild Bird Index, the Local Biodiversity Intactness Index, which looks at changing community and richness with land use and so on. But the problem is a lot of these indicators that are associated with the global targets have not necessarily been designed for that, for lots of practical reasons like time constraints and data constraints, funding shortages. The indicators that have been available have just been applied to these global targets. And the problem is that they won't have been specifically designed for that job. So they were designed around some other objective originally, and now they've been applied to a different one. And you might also get one index that's been applied to a whole range of targets. So for example, the Red List Index is suggested for 12 Aichi targets and 6 SDGs. So where we come to next is if they've been originally designed for some other purpose, we really need to understand how they behave if we're going to be able to interpret them reliably. And here's just an example from Collin and Nicholson in 2014, where they showed how 2 different indices using the same data set can report a completely different trend when you're trying to look for conservation success. So if you have a population that collapses in all but one region, you could have an abundance index that reports a decline, and an extinction index that reports an increase. And it's just based on how those indicators are structured and measured or calculated. And it's not necessarily a problem, but it's really important that whoever's using those indicators understands that that's how they behave, so that they can interpret those trends right. And excuse me 1 second. So there's been quite a bit of indicator testing. If you look at the sphere of fisheries science, they've been testing indicators fairly comprehensively for quite a long time now. There's quite a few programs that have been looking at testing indicators systematically with models or with empirical data, but it's not as common with biodiversity indicators. So what we really need is a structured approach to understanding how well suited indicators are to the job that they're doing, basically. So that includes things like testing them, but there's a whole lot of other factors involved as well. So we look towards decision science or decision theory, because they've been working on this issue of structured decision making for decades now, and it's fairly well established. And the specifics might vary, but generally it's around the idea of making difficult decisions based on a set of structured steps that includes things like really understanding your objectives, the options available to you, knowing what the system variables are and how the system works, what the system dynamics are, and also putting some thought into your constraints, uncertainty, and what the outcomes might be. So we haven't used exactly these steps, but we use those basic components of decision science to derive some criteria that we use to assess some common biodiversity indicators. And our criteria were firstly around the objectives, and that was looking at whether they are explicit and relevant. And that's talking about both the fundamental objectives, which is like the overarching goal of what you're trying to achieve, and the means objective, which is how you achieve it. For example, the Living Planet Index has an overarching goal or fundamental objective of measuring the changing state of the world's biodiversity over time. So that's their main goal. And they do that by measuring the average trends in populations of vertebrates since the 1970s. So we were really looking at whether those objectives have been stated really clearly and if they relate to the thing they're supposed to be measuring. The second criterion is around design. And it's mostly dealing with the idea that methods need to be really clear and reproducible, and they need to be justified. Decisions need to be justified and links need to be justified. And that comes around really strongly to the idea that this needs to be underpinned by a model. And I'm just going to talk about that very briefly before going on. So this figure comes from Billy Geary's recent paper, which talks about different kinds of ecosystem models that you get. And it's just a really nice illustration of the range of approaches that you can take. But what we really are getting at here is the idea that your indicator needs to be underpinned by a model understanding of how the system works, or a theory of change. And that can be anything from a really simple qualitative conceptual model of how different components interact, right up to a complicated quantitative dynamic model of, including things like physical forcing and trophic networks and things like that. But that model really informs all the other steps, and it helps to achieve them. So if you have that model understanding, it becomes much easier to have things like clear objectives, justified links between different components, and so on. The next assessment criterion relates to indicator behavior, and that's mostly around whether it's been tested at all. Do we really understand how this indicator behaves, reacts to different changes in the things that it's measuring or the data that's driving it? Do you understand what sort of impact data bias might have? And that's a fairly large field, but if it's been tested at all, that's pretty much what we were looking for. And then whether it's been updated at all in response to those results. Oops, sorry. The fourth criterion is around uncertainty. And just at a very basic level, it was about whether uncertainty is being considered and the sources of uncertainty are talked about, and then whether the indicator has some way of representing that. And then the last criterion is around feasibility, and that's looking at costs, have they been considered, and that's around data collection and calculation, whether it's being considered in relation to other indicators, the cost of that specific one, and how available are the data, how readily available and accessible are the data. So we took these 5 criteria and sub-criteria, and we assessed some indicators. So we just took a representative sample of 9 indicators that are commonly used, and that's ones that are already associated with these global goals, like the SDGs and the Aichi targets. And we also looked at, we had a wider list of about 35 to start with, and we looked at how well represented those were in global policy documents like Global Biodiversity Outlook and IPBES and various other platforms. And we also tried to get some representation across all realms, so some marine, terrestrial, and freshwater. And we ended up with these 9. And each indicator was then assessed by authors individually, and assessments were, or consensus on the assessment was in the end through group discussion. So they were assessed individually and then group discussion around ambiguous terms and things like that to some consensus on the assessment at the end. So the results that we got showed up 4 main gaps in these indicators. And these are just showing the indicators that we looked at across the top and the criteria at the side. The green is if the green with a little cross shows if the criteria was met. The orange or no symbol is that it was partially met, and then red or the dash sign is that it was not met at all. And the gaps that showed up mostly were, firstly, that the means objectives were not always clear, so it wasn't even clearly defined necessarily, and it wasn't always relevant to that overarching goal or the fundamental objective. And I've underlined underpinned by model and a justified link as well, because they really relate, and you can see the indicators that didn't have a model underpinning the design of the indicator are also the ones on average that it was hard to tell if the means objective was actually relevant to the overarching goal or fundamental objective. And it just really illustrates that having that model understanding is really key to making sure that all of your assumptions about what's related to what, how your metric itself actually relates to what you're saying you're trying to measure, is explicit and very clear. If you haven't got that model, it just becomes very difficult and things get a bit hazy, and that's not really what you want. The second gap that we identified is that many of these indicators haven't been comprehensively tested. It looks pretty good there. There's not any red. Most of them have been tested in some form or other, but we had a fairly low bar for assessing that criterion is met. So if there'd been any testing, we said, that's okay. But the reality is that very few of them have been really comprehensively tested and then updated in response to that testing. There's a couple, the Living Planet Index, Red List Index, and Marine Trophic Index, as well as the Climate Impact Indicator. They've been tested pretty well, but a lot of that is not so much. The third main gap was uncertainty, around uncertainty. And a lot of them didn't acknowledge it at all, really. Some of them provide a measure of uncertainty, like some kind of standard error or something, but most didn't. And that's really a problem, or an area that needs some focus. And then lastly, the consideration of costs is pretty lacking. There was only the Red List Index that had really looked at costs in any detail, and none of them were comprehensive at all. And that becomes really important when you're trying to really motivate for uptake of these indicators for national level monitoring and so on. So yeah, just to summarize, the main gaps were around objectives not always being clear and relevant. There's really a need for testing of these indicators and representing uncertainty, and that's both in the data that's going in, the indicator itself, assumptions, things like that, and cost considerations. So the implications of this are quite, I don't want to say severe, but they're quite wide-reaching. If we don't understand how these indicators work at a really basic level, they become really hard to interpret or interpret reliably. And if you're using them to monitor progress or monitor trend, monitor the state of biodiversity, that's really makes them much less useful, of course. So, at best, they're meaningless. At worst, they could lead to harmful decisions or misleading trends that tell you things are fine when they aren't fine. And obviously, that limits how useful they are in decision-making processes. And that includes things, maybe the behavior of the indicator has been well tested, but if you don't understand the uncertainty associated with it, it makes it difficult to actually use for decision-making. And of course, that has knock-on effects to how much buy-in you're going to get from stakeholders using this kind of indicator. And that goes along with cost considerations. If people and policymakers and managers find it hard to implement or difficult to plan around, it's not going to be used that much, and that means it's not useful. Even if the indicator works very well, it's very accurate and reliable, if it's not possible to implement, then it's not going to be used. And that's just illustrating again that you can get different trends out of the same data set with different indicators, and it's completely fine as long as you understand that. Yeah, and if you understand why, you understand when to expect that, and you can interpret the trends. So things that we could do to address gaps is, number one, and this sort of overarching point covers the next ways to address the gaps as well, but we just really need to use a structured approach. And that's for choosing indicators, which is kind of what we've been using it for here. We've been looking at how well suited indicators might be to what they're being used for in monitoring progress towards global targets. But it also comes down to indicator design, and it's not just indicators, but target design. If you're using a structured approach like the one taken from decision science, which was really clear about needing explicit objectives and having a model understanding involved, and you use that approach when you not just design the indicators but the targets as well, it makes it so much easier to have indicators that actually align with your targets, which means that you can actually monitor effectively. When you're adding indicators post hoc, it's just really difficult to slot them into the target, and they may not, because they've been designed for something else, they're not a perfect match for that target necessarily. So if you can use a structured approach for designing the targets as well as indicators, that would be perfect. And then following from that, but worth stating on its own, objectives are really important and are surprisingly easy to leave out of the indicator design process. It seems like clear objectives really make everything much easier, and there's something that needs to be is vital. The new indicators really need to start from the objectives in. And again, linked to those 2 points, this model understanding, or the idea of having a theory of change of how a system works and what the important variables are and how they interact with each other is just underpinning all of this. It just makes it so much easier to understand where your indicator fits in, how the metric actually relates to the thing you're trying to measure, how to design a testing regime if you understand the important components involved, You understand the sources of uncertainty, you understand the assumptions. That should all be in your model understanding. It just makes everything else much easier and much more transparent. And then lastly, there really needs to be a bigger focus on testing existing indicators and obviously future ones, and providing uncertainty measures. And those figures are just from a paper by Richard Gregory et al. Last year, which is a really nice example of testing an indicator, testing different assumptions and different ways of representing uncertainty. But there are a range of options available already and that have already been tested out and used for testing indicators. And that can include statistical testing or using model systems to see how the indicator reacts to different kinds of pressures and maybe policy changes. And fisheries science is really a place to learn from here because they have a really long history with this compared to biodiversity indicator science. But there are a lot of options available and it needs to become more common, basically. And again, using that model understanding or the theory of change, it becomes much easier to plan a testing program right at the indicator design stage and not just post hoc once you're using it already. So our main conclusions from this bit of work is that we really need a structured approach. And that's for indicator selection, design, and also target design. Clear objectives really help solve a lot of these problems along with the model understanding of how the system works, and we need more testing. So all of this together really would help to make the indicators that we already have much more useful and to get much more value out of them, because the way I'm talking about them not being tested, they're really valuable indices, some of these things, but it's just if we're not sure the contexts to apply them in, the best context to apply them in, we're not getting the most value out of them if we're not understanding them 100%. And it means we'll be much better equipped to track biodiversity change and support these global and national level policy decisions. And yeah, that's in a nutshell what this paper was dealing with. I'm going to talk very briefly about where we've taken this work next. You can all tell it's 2020 by now, I guess. And the Aichi targets were set to run until 2020. Since last year, the post-2020 biodiversity framework has been negotiated. The negotiations started last year. So the CBD and various working groups within that are trying to set up the next 10 years of biodiversity targets. And that's, so far there's been a few drafts that have come out. There was a zero draft, I think it was the beginning of this year, the end of last year. And my research group, along with this work we've been doing in partnership with the IUCN and a lot of other people in different places, has been working to motivate for including an ecosystem goal in that next set of targets. The previous set, the Aichi targets, mostly focused on species. So we've been working on trying to motivate for the ecosystem goal and also talk about what indicators you could use for that. And that's a paper that Emily Nicholson, who runs the lab that I work in, and a bunch of other co-authors wrote, talking about why we need to have an ecosystem goal, and the things that are captured by that you're not getting out of a species-driven goal. And that's really important for capturing other aspects of biodiversity. So what we've been doing is taking this approach we used for this paper that I've just presented, and looking at indicators that could be used specifically for an ecosystem target. And we've assessed a whole lot of indicators against slightly different criteria, but with the same principles in mind, and trying to see how prepared are we to monitor an ecosystem goal, what are the strengths, what do we need to work on. And you can see by the amount of red or N's on this screen that there's really no perfect indicator out there. As with the general biodiversity indicators. But by going through this kind of process, we can work on the gaps. And once we know what they are, it means that we can use these indicators with more confidence and in the context where they are still reliable. And our general recommendations that are coming out of that is that we really need a suite of indicators. None of these indicators are perfect. And many of them are monitoring or are set up to monitor different aspects of an ecosystem. None of them are comprehensive. So we need a suite. Choosing the ones that go into that suite needs to be based on how well aligned they are with the target or the thing they're trying to measure, rather than the fact that they just exist. There needs to be some assessment of what these indicators are actually measuring. There needs to be an increased focus on scalability, and this goes for general biodiversity indicators as well. A lot of the indicators that are quite popular with these global goals are not really practical to implement at national or local scale yet. Many are designed to be scalable, but that hasn't always been tested out yet. So that's a focus for an area that needs focus. And then again, like in the paper, more testing is needed for all of these indicators that already exist to understand impacts of bias, what they're sensitive to, what they're not sensitive to, how accurate they are, things like that. And what we want in the end is a suite of indicators that's complementary and specific to a certain target, rather than a bunch of indicators that are all kind of measuring the same thing and not adding value. And so, for example, with the red list index that's currently associated with a whole bunch of Aichi targets, with 12 Aichi targets, you would want that index to be associated with ones where it's making a really specific and meaningful contribution. And that's what we're working on at the moment. I think we're also working on testing some of these indicators. We're not just complaining about what's out there. We are actually working on trying to make it, trying to improve the areas that we've identified as potentially problematic. And many of the indicators that are already being used are in the process of being tested. So a lot of these issues are being addressed at the moment, but we're really trying to highlight the need that any future indicators that are developed need to be developed within these structured frameworks, because it's much easier to address all of these issues from the ground up than afterwards when you're trying to fit something retrospectively to a target. And that's pretty much what I have to say. Thanks to all my lab colleagues and many of the other people we've worked with, and all of you for listening. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kate. I'm sure everybody's clapping behind their microphone. That was really, really interesting talk. Sounds like you've got across an awful lot of what's been going on in the global indicator space. Mark has kicked off the questioning in relation to why costs have been omitted from so many indices. And I might just add to that in terms of how you would like to see costs integrated into some of these indices if it's such a big gap.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit still. And disclaimer, I'm not an economist or particularly experienced in assessing costs, but just to be considering what those could be, even if you're not necessarily addressing them, but to explicitly consider the costs that might be involved would already be a step forward. And I think that a lot of these things make the most difference if you're considering them at the design phase. Of course, when you've already got the indicator and you're already using it, it becomes harder to address. But if you're trying to figure out the best way to go or the best data set to go with, obviously then cost consideration becomes more useful. But at the same time, when you're deciding which indicator to use later, if you at least have a clear idea of what the costs involved are, and that can be around data collection, it could be around storage or calculation or yeah, I'm not an expert on that, to be honest, but at least those things need to be explicitly considered at the beginning. So at least you can assess different indicators against each other at a later stage. But if you have no idea, really, then it becomes harder.
I guess if you have
yeah, as I said, a lot of these,
Sorry.
yeah, for scalability, that's a big deal. But I just want to make a point that a lot of them do consider it, what's the word, indirectly, because they've used data sets that are as easily available as possible. So something that the government's collecting already, or remote sense data, but that's not always the case. So
yeah, I guess there's sort of hidden costs in there of the data collection as well. We've also had a question about how you went about assessing the different indices. So, you know, you said there were a group of you who all assessed them independently. How much variation was there in different people's perspectives? How subjective did that feel?
Yeah, it was a subjective assessment, I guess. We tried to make it as we tried to define everything as much as possible, and to try and make it more objective. And we had assessment guidelines that we developed, but at the same time, doing those assessments makes you realize how ill-defined a lot of things are. Like, even if you're trying to assess something objectively, I guess developing the criteria was part of the group decision process here, because when you actually started trying to apply the criteria that we had, you realize how much nuance is involved in each point. So as much as it was subjective, as we were going through and we sort of we hit each point of subjectivity, we tried to sort of drill down on that, to use a very what's the word, a cliched term, but we tried to make everything as clear as possible, and to talk through the really subjective points. So it was a qualitative assessment. We didn't count different testing regimes, or we just tried to see if, at a very basic level, has testing been attempted or thought about or implemented at all. So it's qualitative, but we tried to make it as structured as possible.
Some of that sounds subject to, sorry.
Yeah, we have more detailed assessment criteria in the supplementary material of the paper.
Imagine some of that subjectivity is probably quite informative too, in terms of where these things are actually not very clearly defined.
Exactly.
We've also had a question about indices and whether it's important that they have intuitive appeal, so being easy to communicate to policymakers. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's to people who are trying to implement these, or to science communicators, or anyone who's trying to get increased uptake of some kind of new approach, you realize how important that is. But as a group of scientists, we sometimes struggled to understand what had been done, or what the objectives were, and things like that. And the clearer that is, the more uptake you're going to get. And on the one hand, it's going to make it easier for countries to monitor at a national level and meet their targets, or at least monitor their targets at a national level. And on the other hand, you make if it's you that's developing the indicator, you're going to increase the uptake. So it's on the side of the policymakers and the managers, the clearer it is, the easier it is for them. And on the side of the scientists who are trying to get their work used, they've put all of this work into developing an indicator, but if it's really hard to access the data, it's really hard to access the process behind the indicator, it really limits how much that's going to be used. And obviously all of us are trying to work to improve conservation efforts, so we want our work to be used, of course, and yeah, the more clarity, the better from that point of view, for sure. And I think that's part of what we identify in this process, right? If we can't assess something as having a clear objective, I mean, if there's no clear objective, then it's hard to communicate. And I think particularly you get quite a few complicated composite indicators where they have a whole lot of different components that have been joined together in different ways with different weightings, or no, you know, and those ones become really difficult to communicate. And part of a good indicator is something that it's very clear, you know, it goes up, that means something, and that means it's good. It goes down, that means it's bad, something like that. If it's hard to understand what a simple trend means, then that's maybe not a great sign. Yeah.
So I think that it's on people's minds, this idea about scientists and policy use, but one of the questions we've had is in terms of the post-2020 targets and indicators. Do you think that they're actually going to be addressing some of the issues that you've identified?
Yeah, I think they're trying to. There has been quite a bit of emphasis on using a theory of change, so having a model understanding, but it seems to have fallen out of the latest draft a little bit. And I think things like that have gone in at the beginning as a good idea, but when it comes down to actually implementing things, they're not necessarily applied. But I think that they're trying to incorporate that. In terms of addressing things like indicator testing, it's difficult because we need the indicators now, right? So, I mean, that's why we're using this huge range of indicators that are flawed in various ways and useful in various ways. So I'm not sure that kind of thing is going to be addressed within the process. What we're hoping and what we're working on at the moment is motivating for a slightly better process of choosing the indicators. And that's ongoing discussion at the moment. And we've been writing feedback on the drafts, as have many, many other people. And I think they're trying to incorporate all of that. It's a difficult job, but yeah, the research in this area is growing. So I think it can only get better, and there's definitely things like the theory of change that are being included now. Yeah. So hopefully.
And are you able to comment on to what extent expert judgment is being used in indicators, and how important you think it is to include expert judgment?
I can't comment on the extent because we haven't looked at everything, but it's definitely there, and obviously it's going to come up, well, not obviously, but I think it's more likely to come up in more local scale indicators, possibly. It's definitely being used, and I think that can be something that is going to play into how easy data collection is. Perhaps it opens up a whole lot of areas where there's not some handy data set, but there's a lot of expert knowledge that can be utilized without having to go out and collect data. Yeah, and that, especially when you're starting to push this idea of theories of change and model understandings and expert judgment on what's important in the system, becomes really useful or really good resource. So of the indicators that we looked at, it's not actually been that prevalent. Sometimes weightings were decided using expert judgment if different things have been combined, but most of them were using empirical time series. But I think when you start looking more broadly, you would see a fair bit of expert judgment used. And I think especially as there's more and more really established methods for structured expert elicitation, that's going to become more and more important. Yeah.
In your broader set of indicators in the sort of work that you're looking at more now, to what degree are you seeing scalability there? Because it does seem like you know, some of these indicators would be really useful to have from that local up to global scale.
Yeah, so we did look at it. Most of them are designed to have an element of scalability. Often that hasn't necessarily been tested out, like they've been calculated at a global scale and not at local scales yet, or in quite limited studies. But many of them are designed to be applied at any scale. I think, which is where we need to start, right? I think the difficulties always come when you're trying to implement that. Especially a lot of these really large scale global studies, which maybe use data sets that are not as meaningful in some areas of the world. So perhaps they represent the equatorial regions really well, but polar regions not at all, or something like that. And that's the kind of thing that needs to come out of testing. So perhaps the index is designed to be scalable, but we really need to understand if it is and what context it is. And look at regional data bias, like if the index is driven by a global data series, that's theoretically scalable. Say it's at some resolution that's meaningful nationally, but there's just not any data from, I don't know, island nations or polar regions, then you can't use that for those areas. So those are the kind of things that need to come out of testing. And I guess a lot of that, it will be easier if that comes out of testing rather than a country trying to apply it and realizing that it's not meaningful for them. But yes, we did look at it, and most of them try to be scalable, but whether they are hasn't necessarily been tested out yet. Yeah.
And do you have much indication of whether these indicators are actually being used to inform management?
Yeah, some of them have been quite a lot. So things like the wild bird index that in Europe, they've got really great long time series of birds that they can use there. I think the living planet index and the red list index have been used quite extensively for actual decision making. So some of them, particularly the ones that have been around longer, they tend to be the ones that have been tested more. They are actually being used for decision making. The others, yeah, that's actually not something we looked at explicitly. So we didn't look for papers where they'd been used. So that's just based on what I happen to know from those indicators. The ones that I haven't worked on that much, they may have been, but I don't know about it. But the really big global ones that are more recently developed, probably not so much. I mean, I think a lot of the benefit you get from testing indicators and understanding the limitations is not trying to say, oh, this indicator is no use. It's just trying to understand the context that it is useful. And so perhaps some of the global ones are really useful for having a zoomed out idea of what's going on. And some of the other ones are really useful for a local point of view. But just understanding the limitations is really key to use indicators as effectively as possible for where they are really meaningful. Yeah.
I think that speaks a little bit to one of the other questions, which was around whether indicators really can be universal and being suited to that, or whether really they need to be more localized.
Yeah, I think there's definitely, scaling is difficult, right? That's why it's not happening so easily. But it's important that these things are scalable, because if we're going to have these global goals, you need to be able to report at different levels. But perhaps what we need to know is what's important at the different scales. So perhaps, and this would come out of those understanding, the model understanding of a system. If you know what elements are important, that helps you to understand what might change at different scales, what sources of uncertainty or things become more important locally, what data sets become more relevant locally. That allows you to use more local knowledge to say, okay, we've got this big global index. what does that actually mean for us, and what aspects of this, how can we use it in a local way, and that's actually meaningful. But I do agree that it's you can't take something that's been calculated at a global level and make local decisions straight off the bat, yet, in most cases. But that again comes back to indicator testing and understanding the data bias. So perhaps this index is generalizable in these areas because we've got good information, say, about vertebrates, or we've got good information data from Europe and North America, but maybe it doesn't work so well, or it needs tweaking if you're applying it in lesser known areas, things like that. And that's where the local knowledge becomes really important, so that local scientists can, I guess, be brought into the process of choosing the indicators and understanding what might work in their region and what might not. And the more testing that's done on them, the easier that process will be. But I think in theory, an indicator should be able to be calculated from global to local. You just need to understand what data set is best at each scale, I think.
If there are any other questions, people should feel free to pop them in the chat. If there aren't, I might sneak one more of my own in, if that's all right. Sure. So I think it's great that you're talking about theories of change and those underpinning indicators, but I'm sort of struggling to get my head a little bit around how a theory of change might function at sort of like a global scale indicator that's sort of aggregating up lots of different things. I wonder if you could say something a little bit about how, because, you know, theories of change could be as narrow as, you know, for a particular interaction in an ecosystem all the way.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important. It's difficult to talk about these in very general terms, because obviously at global scale or local scale is going to be different things that are important. But I think, as I understand anyway, with the theory of change, if you're trying to pull out the really important variables or the important components, so, and perhaps that may change at different scales, or say you have a theory of change of how some global indicator relates to biodiversity, so you understand how your metric is relating to the thing you're trying to measure, but you would also have picked out the key elements of that system, and by picking those out, you could then look at each of those and say, okay, well, which one of these is most likely to be impacted by scaling? How is this one going to be pretty much the same at a global scale or local, or is this one going to change dramatically? And then at least you'll know where to put your focus when you're looking at scalability, where you might need to tweak, or where you might need to find some local data set that's better. If you understand the key components that are feeding into this, whatever system it is that you're looking at. So just in terms of identifying what's important, I think it's really useful. It might not tell you, the global theory of change might not tell you all the details you need for the local system, but at least you can pick out what you need to identify in your local system to relate them. If that answers your question, or I think.
Yeah, I think it leads to an interesting challenge if we think about our theories of change as being, you know, documenting our hypotheses about the system. They sort of, those hypotheses might vary a little bit at scale, but as you said, they could still be used to inform, you know, how you use the indicator relative to the questions that you have. Yeah.
And I think it just really helps to start working on the problem, at least. If you can tell from looking at the theory of change that's attached to a global indicator, you can tell that that's maybe not going to work so well in your local system for X reasons based on that theory of change. At least it's explicitly labeled there. These are the things we've considered. These are the processes. And then you can start to try and overlay more nuanced local knowledge on that, I guess.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. We've had a question about where to find your paper, and I understand it's in early view online already.
Yeah, I should have a link. I'll quickly try find a link to paste it.
Yes. Yeah, actually, Mark, if you could pull up the DOI and paste it in the chat, that'd be great. But yes, it's in early view for conservation biology. So you should.
Somewhere I have that.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming along. I hope you really enjoyed Kate's talk, and if you want, as you're leaving, to turn your camera on and give her a wave. I'm sure she.
Thanks, everyone. It was great to have you along. And please feel free to get in touch if you have any questions you want to chat about this further.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much, Kate. It was wonderful, wonderful talk. I learned a lot. I really appreciate it. And next week, do join us again, Wednesday. It'll be 9 hours later than today's presentation. And it's about using the media to make a point. I'm paraphrasing. But I hope to see you next week. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Mark.
Sorry about that. I think I dropped out. Hopefully the recording didn't.
Thanks, Carly. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Kate.